The sun shone brightly over the elite California school, casting a warm glow on the perfectly manicured lawns. Students milled about, laughter ringing in the air, but it was not the laughter of joy. No, it was the sharp sound of mockery that filled the space as Dorian Kensington and his friends targeted their latest victim, Mrs. Mendez. She stood at the front of the classroom, her hands trembling slightly as she presented her art project, a colorful depiction of a dreamscape filled with vibrant colors and swirling forms. "Look at that! Is she trying to paint a rainbow or a toddler's nightmare?" Dorian sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. His friends erupted into laughter, their faces lit with delight at the expense of their teacher. Mrs. Mendez paused, her smile faltering as she glanced at the group. She tried to brush it off, but the embarrassment was visible. "Dorian, that's not very kind," she said softly, attempting to regain control of the room. "Kind? Oh, come on, we're just having fun," he shot back, his bravado on full display. The laughter only intensified, a cruel wave washing over the classroom, drowning out any sense of respect or empathy. Dorian's heart raced with a thrill that came from the power of the crowd. Yet beneath the surface, a whisper of discomfort nagged at him, a feeling he quickly dismissed. Who cared about a boring art teacher? As the laughter echoed, Dorian scanned the room, drinking in the attention. He reveled in it, a king on a throne of mockery, even as a shadow loomed in the back of his mind. What was it that made him feel uneasy? He shook his head, choosing to ignore the feeling. Instead, he threw out another jab. "Maybe next time, Mrs. Mendez will try to paint something we can actually look at." The moment felt electric, and the laughter seemed to grow louder, but the joy was fleeting. In the midst of the chaos, Dorian caught a glimpse of Mrs. Mendez's face. Her eyes, usually bright and lively, were now filled with hurt and disbelief. For a brief moment, the noise faded, and all he could see was the impact of his words. A flicker of guilt shot through him, but he quickly buried it under layers of arrogance. The room fell into a brief silence as Mrs. Mendez collected herself. "Everyone has the right to express themselves, Dorian," she said, her voice steady but strained. "Art is about feeling, not just looking." Dorian rolled his eyes, but there was a tremor in her tone that caught him off guard. What did she know about feeling? He shrugged it off, turning back to his friends, who were still laughing. "Whatever, let's just move on. This is boring," he said, trying to re-establish his dominance in the group. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and the students began to shuffle out. Dorian felt a mixture of triumph and something else, something he couldn't quite place. The thrill of being the center of attention mingled with a sense of emptiness. Did he really need to be this person? But he pushed the thought away, the laughter of his friends echoing in his ears, drowning out the voice of doubt. As they left the classroom, Mrs. Mendez stood still, her expression a mask of hurt. She watched the students depart, her heart heavy with disbelief. In that moment, a silent resolve began to form within her. She would not let this bullying go unanswered. The laughter may have come easily to Dorian and his friends, but she would find the strength to fight back. In a world filled with privilege and disdain, a shift was brewing beneath the surface. Would anyone see the cracks in the facade? Would Dorian ever confront the truth hiding within him? As the school day continued, the air thickened with unspoken questions, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither Dorian nor Mrs. Mendez could avoid. Dorian Kensington sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the walls of his room adorned with trophies and awards. Each piece told a story of achievement, but they also whispered the expectations that had been placed upon him since childhood. He could almost hear the echoes of his mother's voice, filled with pride and pressure. "You must always be the best, Dorian. We expect nothing less." As he looked at the photos pinned above his desk, a flashback washed over him. He was younger then, a carefree boy with messy hair and a bright smile. In those days, he would run through the sunlit yard, laughter spilling from his lips as he played tag with his friends. "Come on, Dorian, You can't catch me?" his friend Ben would shout, his laughter ringing like music in the air. Those memories felt distant now, like a dream slipping away upon waking. Why can't things be like that again? Dorian muttered to himself, feeling a pang of nostalgia. But the carefree days were gone, replaced by a constant need to project confidence and superiority. Dorian's friends, who once admired his joyful spirit, now looked to him for validation in their social games. He felt the weight of their expectations, the need to be the golden boy they all looked up to. "You can't show weakness, Dorian," he reminded himself, forcing a smirk onto his face as he recalled the scene from Mrs. Mendez's art presentation. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the school, Mrs. Mendez sat at her desk, reflecting on her own challenges. The art teacher had faced her share of struggles, trying to gain respect in a field dominated by men. She remembered the first day she walked into the school, full of hope and enthusiasm. "I'm going to make a difference," she had told herself, but the reality was often different. The stares from some colleagues and the dismissive comments made her question her worth. Why can't they see the value of art? She would often wonder, her heart heavy with the burden of proving herself. She had endured the whispers and the doubts, much like Dorian was now grappling with the pressures of his life. In her heart, she sensed the vulnerability behind his arrogance. "He's just a boy trying to fit in," she thought, hoping he might one day understand the importance of kindness. As Dorian sat in his room, the internal conflict grew within him. He thought back to his actions during Mrs. Mendez's presentation. It was just a joke, he tried to convince himself, but the laughter that echoed in his mind felt crueler with each passing moment. He could see Mrs. Mendez's hurt expression, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. "What if I'm not who I thought I was?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The pressure to uphold his family's image pressed down on him like a heavy weight. "I can't let them down," he said, clenching his fists. But he also began to question the social hierarchy he had always embraced. Was it really worth it to bully someone to maintain his status? The thought gnawed at him, leaving him restless. Later that night, Dorian found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The boy looking back at him felt like a stranger, masked by arrogance and bravado. "You need to change," he said, but the fear of losing everything he had built held him back. With a sigh, he flopped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. Maybe it's time to stop pretending, he thought, feeling a mix of hope and fear. For the first time, he began to see the cracks in the facade he had built. Dorian closed his eyes, wishing for the carefree days of his childhood, yearning for a way to rediscover the joy that had been buried beneath layers of expectation and pride. In that moment of vulnerability, he realized that beneath the surface, he was still that same boy who once ran through the yard, unburdened and free. But now, he faced a choice: to continue down the path of arrogance or to embrace the possibility of change. The journey ahead was uncertain, but perhaps it was time to seek a new beginning. Dorian Kensington stood at the edge of the party, a sea of laughter and chatter surrounding him. The bright lights of the California night illuminated the faces of his classmates, yet he felt more like a ghost than a guest. Despite being in the center of social activity, an overwhelming sense of loneliness washed over him. He had always been the golden boy, but tonight, the title felt heavy, like a mask that no longer fit. As he moved through the crowd, Dorian caught snippets of conversation. His friends joked and shared stories, completely unaware of the weight pressing down on him. He tried to laugh along, but each chuckle felt forced, a hollow echo of the joy he once felt. Suddenly, he spotted Noah, a classmate who had always been more of an observer than a participant in their circle. Noah approached Dorian, a serious look on his face. "Hey, Dorian," he said, his voice steady but low. "Can we talk?" Dorian felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew what was coming. "Sure," he replied, trying to keep his tone light. "What's up?" Noah stepped away from the noise, leading them to a quieter corner of the yard. I just wanted to say, what you did to Mrs. Mendez was really messed up, he said, his eyes locked onto Dorian's. It's not just funny, it's bullying, man. Dorian flinched at the word. Bullying. He had never thought of it like that. I was just joking around, he defended weakly, his mind racing. Everyone laughed. It was just a moment. A moment? Noah shook his head. You humiliated her in front of all of us. She's a teacher. She deserves respect, not ridicule. You need to think about how that made her feel. Dorian felt the walls closing in. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He had always seen himself as the life of the party, the one who made everyone laugh. Now he felt exposed, like a fragile bubble, ready to burst. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I didn't think it through. Noah crossed his arms, his expression softening slightly. You need to take responsibility, Dorian. People are starting to see you differently. Your friends, they're not laughing like they used to. They're distancing themselves. Maybe it's time to reflect on who you want to be. Dorian's heart sank. The realization hit him like a wave. He glanced around the party. The laughter felt distant now. He could see a few classmates whispering and glancing in his direction. The weight of their disappointment pressed down on him. He had always prided himself on being the center of attention, but now he felt like a pariah. Do you think they'll forgive me? Dorian asked, a hint of desperation in his voice. I think it starts with you. You need to apologize, Noah said firmly. And mean it. That's the only way to start making things right. Dorian nodded, though uncertainty clouded his mind. I'll think about it, he replied, not fully convinced. As the party continued around him, Dorian felt the emotional turmoil rising within. He had spent so long building this image of himself, but now it felt like it was all crumbling away. The laughter that once filled his ears now sounded like a taunt. He turned away from Noah, needing a moment to breathe. The night dragged on, but Dorian found himself retreating into his thoughts. He realized how fragile his social standing was. His so-called friends were beginning to pull away, and with each passing moment, he felt more alone. When the party finally ended, Dorian walked home under the stars, the cool night air doing little to soothe his inner turmoil. He felt the weight of loneliness settle on his shoulders, a heavy reminder that being the golden boy came at a significant personal cost. As he approached his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to change. But how, and would anyone still care? Dorian stepped inside his home, the silence greeting him like an old friend. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, staring into the darkness of the living room. He was no longer sure who he wanted to be, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, deeper than any laugh or insult ever could. Mrs. Mendez sat at her desk, her heart pounding with a mix of determination and anxiety. She had decided to organize a meeting with her fellow teachers to address the growing bullying culture at the school. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating her workspace, yet it felt dim compared to the weight of her task. She took a deep breath and began to write down her thoughts. I cannot let this continue, she whispered to herself. It's time to stand up. As the school day ended, Mrs. Mendez gathered a small group of teachers in the staff lounge. They sat around a table, some sipping coffee, others looking at her with curious eyes. Mrs. Mendez cleared her throat, ready to speak. Thank you all for coming, she started, her voice steady. I want to talk about bullying in our school. It has become a real problem, and we need to address it together. Mr. Johnson, a history teacher with a skeptical look, leaned back in his chair. But do we really have a bullying problem? Kids tease each other all the time. It's just part of growing up. Mrs. Mendez shook her head. This is more than just teasing. What Dorian did to me was not just a joke. It hurt. And I know I'm not the only one. We have to create a safe space for our students. A few teachers nodded, but Mr. Johnson remained unconvinced. What do you suggest we do? We can't control every interaction. Mrs. Mendez's resolve strengthened. We can start by educating our students about empathy and respect. We need to make it clear that bullying will not be tolerated. Meanwhile, in the bustling hallway, Dorian Kensington walked with his friends, the laughter of the group ringing loudly. As they approached a locker, he overheard two students talking about the incident with Mrs. Mendez. "Did you see what Dorian did? It was so mean," one girl said, her voice low but filled with disbelief. "Yeah, I can't believe he thought that was funny," replied her friend. "He's been acting like a jerk lately." Dorian paused, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He turned away, trying to brush off their words, but they lingered in his mind. He felt a mix of anger and guilt. "They don't understand," he muttered to himself, but deep down, he knew there was some truth to their words. Later, as the day faded, Dorian found himself cornered by a group of classmates. They crossed their arms and looked at him with disappointment etched on their faces. "Dorian, what were you thinking?" One girl, Sarah, asked, her voice firm but concerned. "You crossed a line with Mrs. Mendez. She's our teacher, and we're supposed to respect her." Dorian shifted uncomfortably. "I was just joking around. It didn't mean anything." Joking or not, it hurt her. "You need to think about how your actions affect others," another classmate, Jake, added. "This isn't who you are supposed to be." Feeling the weight of their words, Dorian opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, he felt a wave of vulnerability wash over him. He realized that he had allowed himself to become someone he did not recognize. That evening, Dorian found himself alone in the art room. The quietness surrounded him, and the colorful splashes of paint on the walls seemed to mock him. He stared at a blank canvas, feeling lost. "Who have I become?" he thought, his heart heavy with regret. He picked up a brush, feeling its familiar shape in his hand. As he dipped it into the paint, he began to reflect on his choices. Each stroke on the canvas became a release for his emotions. The colors mixed together, a representation of his inner turmoil. "I don't want to be this person," he murmured softly. "I want to change." In that moment, Dorian longed for redemption. He wanted to reach out to Mrs. Mendez, to apologize, and to understand more about the pain he had caused. As he painted, he realized that this was the first step to finding his true self again, a self that was not defined by arrogance and privilege, but by empathy and growth. Dorian Kensington stood outside the art room, his heart racing. He had thought about this moment countless times, but now that it was here, he felt a mix of fear and regret. After everything he had done to Mrs. Mendez, he needed to face her. He took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Mrs. Mendez's voice called from inside. He opened the door and stepped in. The room was filled with the scent of paint and fresh canvases. Mrs. Mendez was organizing her supplies, but when she turned and saw Dorian, her expression changed to one of surprise. "Dorian," she said, her voice cautious. "What brings you here?" He swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. I wanted to talk about what happened." Mrs. Mendez crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue. Dorian felt the weight of her gaze on him, and he knew he couldn't back down now. "I was wrong. I treated you terribly, and I'm sorry." A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken feelings. Finally, Mrs. Mendez spoke, her tone steady but soft. "Why now, Dorian? Why do you want to apologize after everything?" "I've been thinking a lot," Dorian replied, staring at the floor. "I didn't realize how much my actions hurt you. I thought it was just a joke, but I see now that it was cruel. You didn't deserve that." Mrs. Mendez studied him, her expression shifting from skepticism to a hint of understanding. "It takes courage to admit when you are wrong. I appreciate your honesty." Dorian looked up, relieved yet still anxious. "I want to do better. I want to help you with your art programs. I want to make things right." "Helping me is a good start," she replied, her voice warmer now. "But it's not just about helping me. It's about understanding the impact of your actions and making a real change." "I get that now," Dorian said earnestly. "I never thought about how my actions affected others. I was just trying to fit in, to be the cool guy." but it's not worth it. Mrs. Mendez nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. Empathy is a powerful tool, Dorian. It can help you connect with others in a way you never expected. I have faced bullying too, and it was hard, but I learned to rise above it. Dorian felt a flicker of hope. What did you do? He asked, genuinely curious. I found strength in my art, she explained, her eyes lighting up. Art allowed me to express my feelings and connect with those who understood me. It became my refuge. Dorian's mind raced. I used to love painting. I forgot how much joy it brought me. Maybe I can find my way back to that. Mrs. Mendez smiled wider now, her eyes filled with encouragement. That's the spirit. Art can be healing. It's a way to express yourself and help others see the world through your eyes. I want to create something meaningful, Dorian said, his voice filled with newfound determination. Can we work together on an art project? Something that promotes kindness and understanding? Mrs. Mendez beamed at him, her heart warmed by his sincerity. I would love that. Together, we can make a positive impact on our school community. As they began to brainstorm ideas, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Dorian felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer the arrogant boy who had bullied his teacher. He was a young man seeking redemption. Thank you for giving me a chance, Mrs. Mendez, Dorian said, his voice filled with gratitude. I won't let you down. I believe in you, Dorian, she replied, her tone full of hope. Change takes time, but it starts with a single step. Let's take that step together. In that moment, Dorian felt a sense of purpose flooding his veins. He was ready to embrace this new path, to forge genuine connections, and most importantly, to change. As he left the art room, he glanced back at Mrs. Mendez, feeling a renewed sense of respect for her. This was just the beginning of his journey towards self-discovery, and he was eager to see where it would lead him next. Dorian Kensington stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time that morning. He felt nervous, a feeling that seemed foreign to him now. As he looked at his reflection, he took a deep breath. Today was important. He was ready to face his classmates and show them he was serious about changing. At school, whispers followed him down the hall. Some students looked at him with skepticism, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Dorian felt their stares, but he kept his head high. He had come to accept that not everyone would welcome his transformation. Just keep going, he whispered to himself, reminding himself of the journey he had begun. In the cafeteria, he found a spot at a table with Mrs. Mendez and a few other students who were interested in the new anti-bullying initiative. Thanks for joining us, Dorian, Mrs. Mendez said, her voice warm yet firm. Your presence here means a lot. Dorian nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude for her support. I want to help, he replied, his voice steady. I know I messed up, and I want to make things right. As they discussed plans, Dorian noticed a group of students sitting nearby, casting glances in his direction. He recognized them as the ones who had laughed at Mrs. Mendez during her presentation. A wave of shame washed over him, but he pushed it aside. I can't change the past, he thought, but I can change how I act now. Later that day, Dorian joined Mrs. Mendez as they prepared for the school-wide assembly. The gym buzzed with energy as students filed in, some curious about the initiative, others indifferent. Dorian felt a knot in his stomach as he stood beside Mrs. Mendez on stage, ready to speak. Thank you all for being here today, Mrs. Mendez began, her voice carrying confidence. We are here to talk about a serious issue, bullying. It affects everyone, and we all have a role to play in stopping it. Dorian stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. I used to think being popular meant putting others down, he admitted. But I've learned that true strength comes from lifting each other up. His heart raced as he glanced at his classmates. Some looked surprised, while others frowned, still unsure of him. After the speech, Dorian approached a group of students who had once been his friends. Can we talk? He asked, his voice a mix of hope and uncertainty. They looked at each other before one of them, a girl named Jenna, sighed. "What do you want, Dorian?" "I know I hurt you all. I'm sorry. I want to change, and I hope you can help me," he said earnestly. Jenna crossed her arms, skeptical. "Why should we believe you?" "Because I'm trying," Dorian replied, his voice steady. "I want to show you that I can be better. Please give me a chance." The group fell silent, and Dorian could feel the tension in the air. After a moment, Jenna nodded slowly. "Okay, just remember, it's going to take time." As the weeks passed, Dorian found himself drawing more and more. He picked up a paintbrush and rediscovered the joy of creating art. Each stroke on the canvas felt like therapy, helping him express emotions he had long buried. He often stayed after school, lost in his work, the colors brightening his once dark thoughts. One afternoon, Mrs. Mendez stopped by the art room. "Dorian, this is beautiful," she exclaimed, admiring his latest piece. "You've really come a long way." "Thanks, Mrs. Mendez," he replied, a shy smile forming. "I feel like I'm finally finding my voice again." "That's the power of art," she said, her eyes shining. "It allows us to heal and connect with others." In the following weeks, Dorian noticed small changes around him. Some classmates began to approach him, curious about his artwork. They would ask questions and share their own experiences. The once divided group of students started to unite, supporting each other in their shared goal of creating a kinder school environment. As the chapter closed, Dorian reflected on how far he had come. He still faced challenges, but he now understood the importance of empathy. He felt a sense of hope, believing that change was possible, not just for him, but for everyone around him. With the support of Mrs. Mendez and his peers, he was ready to face the future, eager to continue his journey of redemption and self-discovery. Share this story if you believe that change is possible for everyone, no matter their past. Leave a comment about a time when you chose to embrace empathy and make a positive impact in someone's life. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.